You see, what we're trying to do here, we're just trying to get a feel for how people spend their day. So, if you would you just walk through a typical day for you?
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I generally come in at least 15 minutes late. I use the side door. That way no one can see me. And after that, I just sort of space out for about an hour.
Space out.
Yeah, I just stare at my desk, but it looks like I'm working. I do that for probably another hour after lunch too. I'd probably say that in a given week, I do about 15 minutes of real, actual work.
Cam, would you be a good sport and indulge us and tell us how a little more?
I have 8 different bosses right now.
I beg your pardon?
8 bosses.
8.
8, Nick. So that means when I make a mistake, I have 8 different people coming in to tell me about it. That's my real motivation. It's not to be hassled. That and the fear of losing my job. But you know, Nick, it will only make someone work hard enough not to get fired.
Welcome to It's About Nothing. Today we discuss the future of work. Okay, Cam, just to put you at ease a little bit because you probably don't want people thinking that was really you in your day, no doubt.
No,
No, but that came from a movie. Do you know what movie it came from?
I don't actually. No.
It's a film called Office Space.
Okay, office.
Yeah. So this was, I think, late 90s or maybe, yeah, probably late 90s,
Who was
98,
in it?
99. Oh gosh, I can't remember the actor. You'll know him if you see him.
Yeah.
But yes, it was one of those films that kind of gave you. It was it's a comedy, but it was very much ahead of its time in terms of a bit like The Office, like the British Office or even the US version of The Office. It was
Yeah.
showing you a day in the life of,
Yeah.
it was showing you people working in an office and all those annoying, irritating things that management do and all the
Yeah.
policies and procedures and everything.
Oh, I'll have to check it out. That sounds good. It also reminded me, George Costanza. I know one of your favorite all-time characters has a sort of a technique where he just looks like he's annoyed all the time at work. So he feels that if he looks annoyed and stressed, then his boss is sort of going to leave him alone. That's when he's working at the New York Yankees, and he's the guy who comes in, and I can't remember who the boss is. It's not Mr. Steinbrenner. It's Mr. Wilhelm, I think.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, Mr. Wilhelm comes in and he always looks annoyed, so he just sort of leaves George alone most of the time. And yeah, I could actually see that would work. I reckon it
Yeah, no, definitely, and I guess pretty common knowledge that people often talk about that they usually get more work if they do a good job, and so
yes, yeah,
there's usually a handful of people who are lumped with the majority of the work because they just get it done,
yeah,
and then one of the things I remember working in an office was there were certain individuals who you really just didn't go and talk to very often because they were simply not approachable. And so they would often get away with being able to just sort of sit in their office and not really do much at all because
yeah,
everyone was too scared to go in and talk to them.
yeah. There's a similar thing. It's a little different, but in the public service, like I've sort of just as an observation that sometimes sections in departments, they'll have budgets, and you think they'll be motivated to come in on a project under budget or do something under budget if they can, but they're not, because sort of the principle there is that if they do it under budget, then the next time the budget will be less because they'll have proven that they can do a job with less money. So unless they're sort of really forced to make the cutoff, and they won't, because
Yes.
they'll find themselves operating with, and not just in public service. I've seen it in universities too, actually.
Oh, look, I think, to be honest, I think it's probably everywhere.
Yeah,
There's always this game of negotiation going on with everything. It's always if you need to get like a consultant in, or if you need to get an extra resource in, people will often come in and say, "I need 3 new people," because they know that at the very least, they'll probably get one.
yeah,
And so
yeah,
there's non-stop conversations happening all the time where people are asking for very unrealistic things because they know that if they ask for something reasonable, then people will think, oh, well, they can get by if they need one extra person. I'm sure they can just absorb the extra.
Yeah, it's a funny process. Like, if you're in many parts of the world, but for some reason I'm thinking of the night market in Chiang Mai. So if you go there and do a little shopping, whether you buy some some knickknacks or some carvings or some cheap t-shirts, like they'll tell you the price, and it's always 3 or 4 or 5 times more
Yes.
than the price they actually expect to get. And then there's this little dance that goes place about a discount or a special price for you today. You have a bit of a chat with them. You might make a pretense of walking away. You might actually walk away because you don't care that much, and then they're sort of following you down the street, and then eventually you come to an agreed price. But I've seen some people over there like not understand the system and just hand out whatever money is requested in the first instance. And I mean, it's almost always taken, but it's sort of,
Yeah, it's part of the dance, isn't it?
yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
So today we're talking about work, and I picked the Office Space script because one of the reasons was, and something we can talk about with our guest today as well, is there seems to be, at least from my experience now, things are flipping around a little bit more towards trying to design work to be more engaging and interesting for employees.
Yeah.
And so it's not always about money anymore. Like, it isn't, retaining people isn't always about, well, we've just got to keep paying people more, offering more money. It's people, organizations are now thinking a lot more about, how do I make the experience for that employee a lot better, and give them better work-life balance arrangements, and how do I think about what's really meaningful and useful to them. And quite, it could quite easily be that if we think about the future of work, it could actually be a big trend, or perhaps not. We'll invite our guest in a minute, but it relates to a trend. I looked up a few trends that I would throw up today as well. I thought you and Mark can have a commentary on them as well. One of the trends being that whilst we all think we're working longer, if you actually look at the trend over, say, the last 100 or just over 100 years, we're certainly working a lot less than our ancestors. But certainly, I guess, in our conversations, we talk about that things seem to be getting worse and worse. We're working longer and longer, and we're never escaping our phone. But what's the comparison group? Is it the comparison group of 3 years ago, or is it 100 years ago? It's quite interesting when you sort of look at long time scales.
Yeah.
So what we're going to discuss today is we're going to maybe think about the future of work, and maybe set a rough idea of maybe 5 years or so. Like, let's not think about the future of work this year, but after, hopefully, pandemic's over and other major trends have been realised, what will it look like in 5 years' time? Where do we think we're going? And we've invited one of our guests back, Mark Andrew, who's a human factors specialist, and he is going to join us for that discussion. So I will bring Mark in now. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Nick. Hi, Cam.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So, Mark, do you think, compared to 10 years ago, are you working more or about the same?
No, I might be. I might be an outlier. I'm working a lot less for a number of reasons. Actually, the amount of work available is more. There's no doubt about that. So, if I was a sensible person and wanted to feather my super nest, I'd be working a lot harder than I am. But there's certain anomalies with me about overseas travel and stuff like that. So I would say, for the rather than me, my cohorts and my peers, I think, are working their asses off, pardon my language, just because the space we're all in has blossomed. And instead of us struggling to promote the value of the work we do, I love this work as well. I'm really glad that we just dig straight in on that word work, because it was actually one of my primary study areas, work. That's what ergonomics is, the laws of work. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but yeah, I'd say it's increasing. It's definitely increasing. The other thing that I'm painfully aware of is, how can I put this we have, I think, a bit of a solipsistic view of our lives. Solipsism is that the self is the center of everything, and everything that we look at is to do with us. But of course, if we take a really fair global look at work, if you go to the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and they will tell you quite clearly with very good stats that, the largest contingent of vulnerable at-risk workers worldwide are people working as child rearers and house managers and a housewife with 2 kids, doing all of those things. And if you speak to anybody in Australia or around the world, they run off their feet. It's an incredibly long, difficult to manage type of work. Now, if you happen to be a 9-year-old child in Mumbai looking after two under twos while your parents go out to work, it's also an incredibly dangerous workplace, because the place is full of chemicals and height falls and all that type of stuff, and marauding adults trying to get in, all these types of things. So work it's really easy to just think, oh, the future of work, I think I'll dial into that, because maybe they'll tell me how high my laptop should be when I work from home. But actually, if we go back, this will only take a couple of minutes, but if we do go back a long way, if we go back to, say, Neolithic times, had this fantastic lecture. That's not when I was at university, by the way. Had this fantastic lecture on Grimes graves and the Neolithic flint mines in Norfolk. What's that got to do with ergonomics? Well, it's about the organization of work and how much we work and how equitable it is. And perhaps one of the things we'll look at is this tension between equity and meritocracy, because actually, ideally, we want to provide for both. Anyway, back to Grimes graves. It's a flint mine, and it's pre-iron and bronze. So the flint, of course, is an edge weapon, and you put on a spear, and great. Now, the people in the quarry chipping off the flint with some actually ingenious hand tools fashioned from reindeer antlers, which allowed them to chip the flint off. They got a fair share of the venison from the hunters, bringing the slaughtered venison back. And you wouldn't really question that too much. That was a self-organizing pre-agricultural system. Now, I want to compare that, if you flash forward now to today, what we've got is we've got people on 0-hour contracts. The food delivery drivers, I saw on the TV the other day, they have to register their own business, their own ABN, so that they manage their own injury, sick pay, holidays, if they scrape a vehicle, all that type of stuff. So that the large firms that they work for, going to deliver the food and taking a small cut, they're just abandoned. Now, you wonder whether, in some areas, whether much progress has been made over the millennia. And that's even taking out the really weird anomalies. In 1940, this wonderful original concept that the application of hard labor and duty will actually lead you to some spiritual enlightenment. Now, unfortunately, that was translated in German as Arbeit macht frei, which is work sets you free. And if you've ever visited Auschwitz or Dachau or Treblinka, actually not Treblinka, it's not on the gate at Treblinka, you'll see it there. And not wanting to confuse the topic, but if you do take this run up through to the last 10 or 20 years, we have quite a narcissistic focus on what it means to us to work from home and this type of stuff. And for the patterns of contract, 0 hours, permanent, whatever, has mixed together and emulsified very rapidly. But actually the history of work and work organization has got some beautiful wins in it, where labor equality and trade unions efforts and these types of things, nationalization of health systems in some countries, these types of things, whereby, the NHS used to be the largest employer in Britain and was a backbone of solid, stable, fair pay. But not so much nowadays. That's a long-winded answer to your question, but yeah, I think there's more work about, and it's getting more torturous and tenuous.
Yeah. I did some reading last year, like a lot of people, on the Black Death. You know, the Spanish flu and the Black Death, because where we're at in history with COVID-19 and that, and as you'd know, like the one thing that came out of the Black Death in Europe was that labor became a lot more valuable, or peasants were suddenly in a position to sort of like dictate the terms of their labor, which was a big change. And there's it's not on the same scale, but there has been some echoes of that in certain sections of the economy here in Australia and internationally at the moment. So there's I guess it goes to supply and demand, I suppose, doesn't it? And sort of who can set the terms, the quality of work and the workplace and working conditions, not just pay, but more broadly.
Indeed, and I think we shared a paper from some policy wonks in the UK yesterday, and they came up with, you might be able to remember this better than me, Kim, that essentially the supply side has been investigated quite thoroughly. Employees, extra flexibility, can they do this, can they do that?
Yeah.
Spin on their heads. Not so much the demand side, where the businesses, particularly productive and service businesses, have not really been challenged anywhere as much to adapt and evolve, using one of your phrases a few months ago, Nick. You know, the businesses, some are very good. You know, Amazon's very groovy at changing work patterns and workflows and the way that they match labor to tasks. But it all suits them. Whereas if you take, for instance, overwhelmed wards in some of the hospitals around the world, particularly Brazil, America and Britain, what you've got is a tragically slow adaptation to the horrors of deadly diseases and dealing with them and all that type of stuff. And of course, what you've got there is a workforce which is incredibly dedicated and therefore not prone to walking away. So you've got a very toxic mix there. And this, of course, is bad news for everybody, but it's hopeful news for people like us who work in work design and organizational design and how we plan. Because I know all of us are helping organizations, you know, gradually change. So, for example, the problem, and it is a problem, of 0 hours contracts. By itself, that's not a problem, because it's not the 0 hours which is the variable, it's the lead time. You know, if you get a text the week before saying you're not needed for that week, you may well be able to gainfully employ yourself somewhere else. But if you get a text at 6 a.m. when you come out the shower that you're not required that day, so it's not the 0 hours. There's nothing wrong with being able to juggle where the supply and demand of work should be. It's the planning horizon and the inclusion of the poor bastard who's getting out of the shower at 6 a.m. who suddenly realizes that he now is idle for the day.
Yeah, to some extent, I suppose it also depends on opportunity, like whether there's other jobs that look after people a little bit better. So if you've got 2 jobs that are more or less the same, but they give people greater notice and care and actually genuinely think about that, then they're obviously, those people will walk out the door somewhere else. But I suppose one thing that prevents that perhaps is in some industries, not all of them, but in some industries, the type of, I guess, working conditions are more or less the same. They're pretty much, you know, flat. So whether you're serving at in a retail store at Target or Kmart, perhaps, I don't know, like I don't know much about the organisations, but potentially you're not going to get too much difference in pay or hours, and the type of work's probably very similar. So even if you say, "Oh, look, I'm sick of getting my shifts cancelled at the 11th hour," you might not. It's only really if you have another option, isn't it? And then that forces the other group to compete a bit more, doesn't it?
Indeed, and what you're describing there, Nick, is essentially the I won't say abuse, the application of power to an unbalanced relationship. because of course the organizations can very quickly adapt to 0 hours contractors and juggle them. But as you described, the contractors don't have power in order to effect change. It isn't a competitive landscape, whether you're delivering from Pizza Hut, or from wherever, or from McDonald's. It's the same shit job. In fact, it's a bullshit job. You remember the book Bullshit Jobs? David Grober of the London School of Economics. It was hilarious when it came out a few years ago, and everyone got this little slim tone, bullshit jobs, but then started to realize that there's quite a lot of gravitas in it. And it was a very sad read, because Bullshit Jobs is exactly what Office Space is about. That's the film that you picked, Nick. Because they're all bullshit jobs, and there's something about a claims report that becomes this thread through this movie, and it actually turns out that the claims report is a weekly thing that nobody reads, nobody needs. It's a bullshit job. The definition of a bullshit job is it's a job where you could actually take it away and it would make no difference. In fact, in some instances, you could take the entire industry away and nobody would notice. In fact, in some cases, it might slightly improve circumstances. Go on, Nick.
Oh yeah, look, I've never worked there, but I certainly, it's strange though that many people I know who've worked at McDonald's have reflect on it as one of their favorite jobs. And surprisingly, but one of the things, I have a friend who worked there, and what they liked about it was it taught them, they liked the structure of it, and it was kind of like a gateway, to just to dip their toe in the water about what work was like. And then for some reason, I don't know what it is about it. I mean, I must admit, I don't think I've ever seen McDonald's workers completely really happy or anything. But they don't strike me when you see them as being just absolutely miserable. But then again, people are good at hiding their misery, aren't they? But but there's certainly those sorts of jobs out there. I mean, you could argue if you remove McDonald's that it wouldn't have an impact on society. In fact, it might be an improvement because it's not exactly healthy. I don't know. Like, I think the Office Space example is genuinely it's like an abstract thing where even the product itself can't be consumed. Whereas at least at McDonald's, you do get something from it, don't you?
Yeah, indeed. Well, and the McDonald's, I've often heard that from people, particularly adolescents who've done a stint at McDonald's, and they were then helped to spin it, not to lie, but to basically say, well, look, it really taught me about timekeeping and teamwork and Kanban and poker yoke, these Japanese process heuristics that help you keep the workplace, housekeeping, all that type of stuff, visual aids as to where we are in the cycle, all that type of stuff. And how to manage conflict, because you get some ugly trucker coming in at 2 o'clock in the morning trying to demand something that they're not serving. So I don't think that is, I wasn't suggesting that McDonald's is a bullshit job, but being on a moped delivering McDonald's is a bullshit job, because it's the same thing over and over again. And with repetition, and delivering to somebody who's too bloody lazy to go and get it themselves. the old chestnut about how to break someone. If you really want to psychologically break somebody, what you do is you get them to dig a hole and then fill it in.
Oh yeah.
And then dig the hole again and fill it in. It's the epitome of the purposeless activity. So perhaps one of the things we need to look at is how we actually encourage people to elicit purpose where perhaps it's not self-evident, because most jobs could be unbullshitted if they had some connection with something that you got derived value and pleasure out of, benefit, because you could see a purpose to it. So somebody's got to empty the sewers and the garbage cans, but it's actually there's value in that, and a lot of people see that, and they actually say, look, it's local. I don't have to get on a plane. I've got a bunch of mates. We go down the pub on Friday, etc. That type of thing.
Yeah, and Mike, I think you've seen it as well. There's plenty of industries which are kind of more operational, where the day is, it has a very set beginning and end. The tasks are very much the same. there's potentially a lot of waiting around, maybe even in hot days outside, and the same people you're with all the time, and the familiarity breeds contempt. And you talk to some people who worked in those industries for a very long time, and it's always a very similar story. Whilst they like the camaraderie and the nature of the job, like the predictability of it, they get a bit cynical, and they start to get a bit sort of I guess unfocused as well, because they've gone through all the motions, and they also start to, in some organisations, start to distrust the management, because they come in, the management teams come and go, and they come in trying new ideas all the time, but they are the steady constants. So if they've been there 20 years, they're notoriously difficult to shift and change, because they become very much like, well, people have tried this so many times. I've seen you in another form 5 years ago, and then 10 years before that. I've seen a variation of you as let's say you're a corporate person or a consultant or something.
Yes.
And you guys eventually leave us alone, and then it goes back to the way it was. And I always, whenever we've done work in those environments, I always think, God, there's a real delicate art, and almost like a great need to really try and break that and understand how can we make those environments better for people to work in? How do we get them to be a little bit more creative, and to also, do things differently, but also do things that are more meaningful for them? But unfortunately, it's like in Australia, we're probably very lucky, but certainly in other parts of the world as well, there's just, the populations can be so enormous that there's this great need for lots of arms and legs to be going out and basically allowing all of us to live, maintain the electricity poles, clean the sewers, maintain the roads, everything, all of these roles, which, we'd be absolutely crippled without them. They're so important. And yet we only really appreciate them when it breaks down or something doesn't work.
Yeah, that happened a lot last year in a way, didn't it? When that whole thing about essential workers came out. And even it's like a lot of people work from home, but there's some people who can't work from home because they have to go and, maintain a sewer or an electricity grid or a road or something like that.
Yeah, well, that's...
Yeah.
Sorry, mate.
No, go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to say that certainly I think what last year and potentially even now in most parts of the world, even still, it's made everyone realise what are the most fundamental jobs out there right now. And certainly people who produce food, emergency workers, healthcare workers, and you could probably argue anyone who's maintaining the internet is probably one of the most critical, top three at least. The people maintaining the software people and the providers who are keeping everything going. I think we wouldn't be having discussion today if it wasn't for them doing that.
Medical research, obviously, frontline healthcare work, and that sort of thing, and maybe government to some extent. Like when you're in crisis, like there tends to be more of a focus on the role of government and the role of the state, whether it's to provide services, to provide stimulus, provide money, all that sort of thing. So the state sort of comes back into focus at times like that.
And I concur entirely. The other category that springs to my mind is the movers and the packers, because you'd be surprised how quickly society breaks down if you can't get your bog rolls and your milk. Now we didn't have that breakdown of society, but if some critical consumables are not available for about 2 or 3 weeks, you get the scenes that you get in Contagion, the movie Contagion, because of course it's a vicious cycle that feeds on itself, because it's not just the shortage, it's the rollout of fear and uncertainty, which then leads to, we all know how it works.
Well, we got a glimpse of that last year. I mean, it was nothing like Contagion, but even the sense that supermarkets were about to run out of toilet paper and rice or whatever it was, they weren't their best selves down there. So we saw nasties. I was going to turn the discussion slightly to, if we were talking pre-COVID about where work might be in 5 years, I think the focus might have been on what jobs would no longer exist. I remember that conversation being a big part of things. And I sort of wonder where we're at with that now. The technology continues to advance. We
Yes.
know that, but has COVID sort of changed that discussion at all?
I'm not sure. Maybe I'd have to apply my mind to that. But as you were framing that question, what jumped into my mind was I was thinking about a real monotonous type job that I'm very familiar with when I go to the big pits like iron ore. They have this, my finger gestures are not going to make any sense on the podcast, but if you can imagine a big spiral road that clings to the side of the open cut pit, and it eventually comes out the top. Now, crawling up that road are massive, great big trucks filled with iron ore. And when you watch them, it's quite mesmerizing because some poor bastard is in there for like 10 hours and they have routine breaks according to the fatigue management plan and everything, and it's air conditioned, but you literally put it into third gear and it just climbs up this ramp, and then it gets to a curve, and then it goes up the other end, and it takes a long time for this thing to get out, and then it dumps its water, then it goes all the way back down again. Now, one of the jobs that probably half of your question was, which are the jobs that are going to disappear? Well, all of that can be done by a machine. You don't need the driver in the cab. And most of in fact, I worked on this a few years ago, a lot of the rail iron ore trains, the freight trains in the West now, are driven by somebody in a control center in Perth.
Yeah.
So they're not driving themselves, but it's just, you can actually rotate people out very quickly so that they do an hour or two. And then they're all in, nice, it's no dust and all that type of stuff. And so those are the types of jobs where I think 10 years ago we'd have gone, oh, I don't know about that. I don't trust somebody, but
that's
but in fact, the Bay Area Rapid Transport System, on the west of America, that's driverless. And it was from the 1960s. Actually, they had to start off with a driver sitting in the cab, not doing anything. Just to get it going. And then after it got going, they sort of said, look, the driver's not doing anything. So then they took the driver out, and now it all works seamlessly.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'm interested also in, work and identity, I guess, and the idea of, I think, is it Elaine de Botton or someone that had maybe written about this? So, when we go to a social situation, the second question is usually, what do you do? So we understand each other by understanding what people do for a living, and often not all people, but many people really define themselves by their job or by their profession, by their career. Although having said that, I know some people who don't at all. Like, for them, they have a very, very transactional relationship with their employment, and it's a means to an end, and they work to live, and I think as long as they're not actively sort of unhappy in their work, they're still pretty happy because they see it in transactional ways. But if we're moving to a sort of future where a lot of if maybe more bullshit jobs are going to be phased out, or sort of low tech things are going to be phased out, like, is everybody going to be more and more fulfilled in the work that they're doing? Because those of us who are sort of still in gainful employment, I suppose, are going to have more and more expectation of doing work that's very, very fulfilling because it can't be done by an algorithm or a machine.
Well, it's a brave new world where we try to overcome that Alain de Botton type stuff on prestige and where you are in the social hierarchy and all that kind of stuff. I think one of his phrases is that, we built societies that are basically crafted around envy and resentment. Because you might have a Mercedes, but I've got a BMW, and all that type of stuff. And the brave new world is where these superficial trappings really don't mean anything. And we go back to that purpose and meaning of what you do. So I've heard lots of people at parties and barbecues sort of, what do you do? And they go, oh, I coach the local nippers team. That's their go-to answer. But he's actually a lawyer, but he's not going to say that because he's
that's interesting.
What do you do? So we pick something else.
I like that in a way, because more and more people now, depending on what work you do, you might do a few different things. Like, you literally wear different hats. So perhaps you focus on the one that's, maybe it sort of, it coincides with your sense of identity, or at least a sense of identity you want to project.
Yeah.
Because it makes you sound Like a great community-minded person.
Mine's much more narcissistic, because when people ask me what I do, I say I'm trying to perfect, just the optimum stock. Stock, and I am. I've tried all sorts of different methods, and I won't go into all of the machinations, but I find it deeply satisfying, and I use a small portion of it for making animal food and stuff like that. And it is more it is more fulfilling than going to an iron ore pit, I have to tell you.
Yeah, there is something. I know there was always talk about decades ago that all of our modern conveniences were basically liberating us, but they discovered that actually, when you found more time, instead of hand washing all the clothes, where most of the time it was the ladies at home doing that all day, non-stop washing. And we're like, oh, we're going to liberate ourselves. And of course, when we got that, then more people just ended up going to work, and then and we found other things to keep ourselves occupied. I'm always curious about whether or not we will ever liberate ourselves from work, because we will never be able to imagine what the future holds in terms of other tasks and activities that will emerge from being liberated from, say, having to drive in an drive a vehicle, or having to commute. Potentially, it's possible that through medical science, people will be able to maintain healthy weights and bodies without exercising, for example. Even though people love exercise, who knows? There could be solutions to that. And then we discover we're not going to go down and have a gym membership anymore. We can spend our time doing things that we really love. And I often think about, shamelessly think about Star Trek, and probably Star Trek: The Next Generation, if you guys have ever watched that. But the vision of the future there is quite interesting, because there's no money anymore. Food is no longer an issue, because you just replicate it with energy. So that's off the table as well. You can also replicate any goods you want as well. So the people in the future, at least in that future, decide they're basically going to focus just on their own knowledge and their own sense, almost like their own self-actualization activities. So the things that make them feel better. And of course, the more you sort of pick it apart, you go, well, it's still a future that's very similar to today, because they've still got the kind of military hierarchies, and the ship's counselor, surprisingly, is still using talking therapy. And this is, hundreds of years in the future. And that's what they've got still, they've got all that kind of stuff. But I always thought maybe if you think of an optimistic future, it might not be as scary as what some are saying, where we're saying, well, artificial intelligence and automation is going to send most of the population into terrible poverty, and they're not going to have work to do. That there will be all sorts of other amazing things potentially that maybe we will be liberated, so we can live like that.
Yeah,
indeed. Well, it puts me in mind of, if you go back, there's probably an academic discipline on this, but if you go back and look at how the agricultural revolution, certainly in the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, basically determined the niches of work and the way that work modules fitted together, delivering unto a supermarket. And I don't have to explain how that contrasts completely with working the land. So if you flew over, you probably might have done like me, flown over the Midwest of America, you will see that it is quilted with carbohydrate fields. I mean, it's corn and it's wheat and it's all this stuff, but they're all carbohydrates. Born of the nonsensical food pyramid that the government came up with in the 1950s. We now know that it should be inverted. And that this idea that we stuff carbohydrates into little kids, so that little toddlers now have got muffin tops around there. It's just obscene, absolutely obscene. Now, I'll take your Star Trek and I'll raise you a Blade Runner. because Blade Runner, what's the latest one? 2049? The newest one. 2040. Now, it starts with this air trip over the Midwest. And guess what? It's quilted with protein farms. What they're doing in 2049, I don't think this necessarily is what is fiction is, they're making little juicy bugs and everything, and they're nearly all protein. And that would dictate the whole sequence of work systems that gets the food to the people. In lots of current metropolitan cities, and I don't mean the Shanghais and everything, but even if you walk through certain parts of Melbourne, there's this disgusting oily hawker soup that's got eyeballs in it and stuff. And I'm not being unkind to certain parts of the world in terms of their cuisine, but it really does look like dishwashing liquid. And it's the spread of it everywhere. And when it's delicious, by the way, it's bloody delicious. But when it's really slapdash and it's thickened with cornstarch and stuff like that, I don't want to take us down the food road, but the work systems, which have emerged in the last 20 years. Nowadays, a lot of my younger cohorts coming fresh out of uni, and they come into a place I work in, an engineering firm, and they're all whiz-bang technologists. They tend to buy an apartment in South Bank, and it sort of hasn't got a kitchen. So in terms of work, they wouldn't dream of making a bloody meal when they get home. They just get something, and it's delicious, and that's fine. And outsource the laundry. So it's amazing how rapidly they change in what we call work and all those work units. It's the what's happened. I'll stop in a minute, but it's the sort of compartmentalization. That's a Scrabble word. That's a big one. Compartmentalization of units of work. So, you don't iron. Maybe you do. I don't know. I don't iron my shirts, obviously, but maybe you don't iron your own shirts. I used to, but now there's a service that does that.
Yeah.
And so on.
Yeah. The Star Trek sort of analogy or conversation reminded me of no money. So if you don't need money, and in our reality, we're not quite up to that point, but there has been this discussion about what they call it, universal basic income, right?
UBI, yeah.
Yeah.
UBI.
Like, could you discuss that a little bit with us? You'll know more about it than I do. I'm familiar with it in the general sense.
Well, I hopefully that was directed at Nick, because I don't know a lot about
it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just throwing it out there, but it's this idea that if we move into a future where a lot of these jobs, I don't want to call them lower rung jobs, but jobs that are going to be replaced by technology, I suppose, in one way or the other, if they're not there anymore, we need to sort of plan for that. And rather than certain people who are unemployed getting an unemployment benefit, I think it's like everybody in society actually, without even necessarily being means tested, would be.
I think you've hit the
money per month.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Cam, because it's not necessarily about the provision of basic income, because that's been a long time, and people in some countries, basically there's no way they're going to die of poverty. Some countries. The U is the big thing, as you rightly said. The U is the universal. So in other words, it actually gets granted, and that's not just a random word I've taken, but it gets granted to every citizen in some countries. And we know some Scandinavian countries have gone down this road. It gets granted to everyone because it's not just about saying this is so you don't starve. It's saying this is so you can make different decisions. So this is basic and you could live on it. But what it does is frees up your anxiety or your dread about what's next. And so it liberates you to take some classes or grow some food or go around and mow the neighbour's thing or clean the neighbour's car or whatever, start a childcare group, all this type of thing, which would not happen if it wasn't universal.
Yeah.
So it reframes.
Is there a difference?
Yeah.
Maybe I don't know much about it myself, but I thought there was a difference between kind of like a basic level that you give people. Perhaps it's more than what we traditionally call the dole, and universal, which potentially I always thought maybe a more extreme version of that is every person on the planet or in your country basically gets the same set amount.
Yeah.
Which of course
I think at one level it is sort of our cosmopolitan thinker friends would see it in those terms, but you'd have to basically have a world government to sort of distribute the
Oh, I
funds.
see. I didn't realize you were going, that's what you were talking about. You're talking about it not being a sovereign issue, but actually a global.
Well, I'm probably talking about it as a sovereign issue. I think Nick's taking it a little bit further, but I have heard it in the form that Nick's talking about.
Gotcha. I mean, it's a fascinating, both of those angles are fascinating, because what they spotlight is the fury of the right-wing liberals in America to this idea. And did I get that right? Right wing, yeah. You know, the rich ones who don't want taxes hired or anything like that. Yeah. My American politics is terrible, but you know, they're furious about this idea, and I think some of the Boris lot, and presumably some of the Scott. Isn't that terrible? I've forgotten his second name. Anyway, you know who I'm talking about. Morris. Yeah, some of his thumbs would furiously argue against this, unless I've misunderstood him. So that would be quite interesting. Whoops.
I mean, we've got an interesting situation at the moment, because we've got Job Seeker pays, I think it's like $750 a week, whereas I think it essentially doubled the old dole, and it's about to be wound back.
Yeah.
As of the end of next month.
Yeah.
So that's a big thing. And there's some advocates arguing for it to be kept at the same level. There's many others arguing for it, well, at least not to go back to what it was before. And I think it's going to be a hard sell to do either of those things. Actually, I don't think it will stay where it is. I think it's going to be hard to get it to go back where it was. But I have heard, and this is very anecdotally, but people I know, particularly in the hospitality space in Melbourne, saying that they're actually at the moment finding it hard to fill positions, because some people are sort of, if they're earning about as much money as they were from a casual waiting job anyway, they're not terribly motivated to go out and take that job, and you know, maybe not get treated very well, that sort of thing. So I mean, I'm being the devil's advocate in a way, but there's an assumption that if the sort of the need to find paid work's taken off the table, we're going to go and use the time we're given productively, or at least in a benign sort of way. Not necessarily.
The issue has always been with all the lines of thought is that there's a degree to which money is a motivator, and it's to Mark's point, you're certainly not motivated with your aspirations if you don't have anything and you're starving and you just don't know what you're going to do with yourself. So, but then there's a question mark around to what extent do you provide enough, but that you anchor money to hard work or maybe not even hard work, but also ingenuity or great talent as well. And of course, I think we've all seen play out that sometimes the scale with the money is not it's not a natural phenomena. It's I think it's Nicholas Taleb, the Black Swan author, refers to the fact that the way the economy works, the way money works, is not anchored by the natural world. So like you'll never see a tree that is the equivalent size of the richest person on the planet. So in other words, you're not going to see a tree that that reaches the moon, because the natural world brings it in order by the time it gets to a certain size. But you do have, and you never see a person who's so tall that they're as tall as a skyscraper either. But with money, you get these bizarre extremes, which are almost anomalies. And I suppose the big debate that's been going for as long as I've been alive, that it's come up a lot more lately, is we now, especially with the tech world, where we've got this ability to basically tap into everyone on the planet. You can potentially be a billionaire by creating some software. Not just a billionaire, but you could make hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's such an unusual thing that can actually happen. But I don't think, and I think the people who are sort of anti that are not necessarily anti the idea that if I'm a surgeon who's got incredible talent, that I'm going to be paid more than someone who's working at McDonald's. Like, I think there's obviously a logical argument to say, well, you could make the counter argument, of course. You could say, well, the surgeon gets at least he gets to do something interesting. Maybe we should pay them poor old McDonald's workers something for doing such a job that requires so mundane.
There's logic to that. I mean, you reminded me of a study, it's an American study, so these figures are in US dollars, but apparently once you get above penury, you know, and you can eat and drink and have shelter, but you know, once you get up to about 50 or 60, this is an old study, so figures would change, 50 or 60K a year. Essentially, as you go above that, there's the law of diminishing marginal utilities. And it really doesn't add, money does not, once you're above penury and you're into social comfort, so you can afford what for you is meaningful and for your family. Going above that actually really doesn't add that much. So the old school thing of throwing money at people, I've been in this position when I worked for Anderson Consulting, part of Arthur Anderson, and every quarter you get an envelope with $5,000 in it. And the partner presumably hadn't paid tax on it either, but through some Swiss method, you got this little boost. And I hated the work. And when I was leaving, they said, "But what won't you miss the envelopes?" Not really.
Yeah.
Not really. I'll have my weekends back, you know.
Yeah, well, that's interesting you say that at the end there, because I find more and more people I talk to, and probably myself to some extent, like when they're negotiating a new job, a new contract, whatever it is, like, you know, money's obviously always going to be central to it, but time is also a factor, I think, more and more for people. And it's probably one they're more comfortable talking about as well. So I think the norm that people want to spend more time with their families, or even they have outside interests, they have a side project that may or may not be something that returns a profit, but just something that they find some satisfaction in. Like they'll more and more try and carve their employment around that. So they might make a little less money than they could potentially, but they might have 4 days a week where they're working and one day out of the week to themselves, or, you know, it can work in various ways. So I'm seeing that more.
That's those little nuggets of time. It doesn't even have to be a big thing like, can I play golf at the weekend or whatever. Those little nuggets of time, and the fact that work presents such different types of stress to people. I'll give you an example. I used to manage a company about the same size as Nick's, and I was based in Sydney. And a lot of the consultants there would be, how can I say, they'd cruise quite a lot during the day. They'd drink a lot of coffee and they'd be chatting quite a lot. When it came to 6 o'clock, they suddenly started doing a lot of work, and then they'd receive a call, and it would be, "Oh yes, dear, I'll be there soon. I've got some really important stuff that I need to finish off." I'll tell you, 2 or 3 of these bastards did it all the time, and I wasn't going to interfere in their private life, but their wives were at home having had hell all day, and all they wanted was for the partner to come back home, collect the kids, bathe them, and then she could have a martini, you know, at 7 o'clock, while they ordered food. But this was not going to happen because he wasn't going to get home. Now, I'm not mentioning any names, but that was quite common. And it's because the stress of being a consultant is not zero, but it pales into insignificance if you've got a couple of under threes crawling all over, because you cannot manage your time. You can't basically say, well, yes, I'll catch up with so-and-so at 3 o'clock at the cafe, because it might not happen. Yeah,
there's a pub in Melbourne called The Office. And I think the joke was that your wife would call or whatever. You know, I'm just at the office, dear. So remind me of that.
Now, there's probably technological solutions to this, because, of course, you know, nowadays consultants will be, nothing to do with COVID, consultants will be working from home 2 days a week, so that they could load share childcare and stuff like this. I mean, I'm no expert. I don't have children, so you know, I'm talking out my house a little bit, but there are probably technological solutions to this in all facets of life, not just work from home, but collective bargaining for childcare and all these types of things. We tend to focus on technological solutions with some wizardry that is going to enable somebody to do a job much better. And I did want to, I think I've discussed it with you both before, but if you look at the example of Google Glasses, Google Holo Glasses, and the case study I saw, it was amazing in terms of the future of work. This is definitely within 5 years, definitely, because at the moment what they're doing, if you have a very, very highly skilled craftsperson working on aerospace technology, they have to get these rivets, pop rivets on the surface actually put in using various stuff. And it has to be very, very flush because it has to overcome the heat of re-entry. So what they do is at the moment, is they're looking and they're shimming, and they might get some microscopy to see what the profile is. Then they go back to a big paper blueprint, and they're looking for how that particular rivet on the underside of the whatever should be configured and chamfered to. Now, what Google HoloGlasses does is that while you're doing that, you've actually bringing up in your glasses a sort of head-up display of the specifications that you should be working to. Now, that might sound trivial, but if you imagine how many tasks all over the world involve somebody working on something and then having to go to some plans or some documentation or what a database, whatever. If you think of the millions of transactions that actually not only makes quicker, but makes much more reliable. So if a spec changes, it's automatically uploaded. That's huge. And you're talking about, the types of savings we've probably all experienced by actually driving along and the sat nav tells you that road's blocked. And so you go down that other one. 20 years ago, we'd have just gone straight into the traffic jam. So all those little trimmings and savings are applicable to many, many more types of work. And I'm not looking for the over compartmentalization of work anymore, but certainly if you actually were to scan as to where you could do that, surgery, a nurse with an IV and setting up, it's, I've forgotten the word for it, but it's ubiquitous. That's it. It will be ubiquitous. And I think we could probably see that in us who use computers, and craftspeople and skilled medics, etc., etc.
Yeah, Mark, I think I don't know if you were discussing this with us or not, but there's certainly, you're probably familiar at least with the Elon Musk chip that they're inventing. That's where they've already tested on pigs, but it's a chip you can insert into your brain, and it's going to have all sorts of functionality. At least initially, it's going to help people with impairments like dementia and things like that. And
yes,
he makes the case study of, you'll have a choice when you're a bit older between holding on to your treasured memories or with the chip,
yes,
or letting them fade away. And most people, if given that choice, will say insert the chip. It's a bit scary, but I don't want to lose my memories.
sure.
But what you described then to me was yet another example of what he refers to as that we're essentially already cyborgs with our phones. We're tethered to them. We rely on them for information. We help them. It helps us navigate. We communicate with them. And these glasses, it would seem like a natural evolution for this essentially augmented reality, is I think what you're describing, where you can look around the world and the information is no longer has to go from your phone to be communicated and translated and then executed. It instantly gets superimposed over the world. And imagine that. I mean, that might not be in 5 years, that you can just look around and allow your brain to do that for you. But it wouldn't surprise me if that sort of technology would eventually then get integrated into the chip, and then you start thinking about the future of work. It becomes obviously not in 5 years, but gosh, you can only imagine. We are certainly, unless there are major catastrophes or complete changes to society that we don't see coming, we are certainly moving towards integrating technology into becoming closer to technology.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just going to say, I wonder what this does for learning, like education, training as well, because imagine if you need to teach somebody a language, so rather than going through that process of studying it and engaging in conversation groups, you can more or less put a chip in there and they'll automatically have fluent Mandarin or French or Swahili or whatever it is. Or I don't know, learning to fly a plane seems to be something that you need, the practical as well as the theory side of it. But
and the muscle memory. I mean, none of these are barriers, though.
No.
I would not think the language one really fascinates me. The adoption of another language, because of course, if you've seen Arrival, sorry about the movie references, I know you love them, but if you've seen Arrival, it's sort of posited on the Edward, doesn't matter. There's two psychologists, and whose idea is that the language of a culture significantly shapes and forms the way it develops. And so in Arrival, you've got the heptapods coming down, and they have to work out what this Rorsch circle language means and so forth. Anyway, it fascinated me because if you're trying to accelerate language uptake, what you're doing is you're not just giving, in a Chomsky sense, the lexicon, the words, or the semantics, or the syntax as to how it actually gets stitched together. And for instance, if you take a Romance language like Portuguese, this is all going to be very, very vital for children of the future, because they're going to need to have a second and third language wherever they are in the world, because it's the means to actually teamwork and so forth. If you took a Romance language like Portuguese, for example, the way that it actually works is much more than the individual elements of what are composited to put across a message. There's a whole cultural meaning behind it. And it reminds me, this is one of my favorite films, actually. I don't know if you're a Sidney Pollack fan. He died, unfortunately, selfishly. But one of his last films was The Interpreter. And Nicole Kidman is a UN interpreter in it.
I love
it's
that.
All fascinatingly wrapped around language, different languages. Sean Penn is an FBI agent. And at one stage, she's a specialist in this language called Ku in Africa, and she's misheard something. But anyway, it doesn't matter. He at one stage says, you know, would you like this murderous African dictator dead? And she says, well, I wouldn't mind him gone. And he says, same thing. And she says, no. If I translated gone as dead, I'd be out of a job. If gone and dead were the same thing, there'd be no UN.
Yeah.
And what we need to be outreaching to in a research and development sense is when we're trying to enable rapid uptake of other languages for children, which I agree is one of the key things. Well, you know, we can forget teaching them about what's the capital of Mozambique. They can look that up. It's these skills, communicative skills, and particularly language, that needs to be thought about, and how we do it, and not just in a rote sense, like learning your times table, but in a community sense, so that you actually absorb, say, the culture of Portugal if you're going to learn Portuguese.
I'll have to wrap up in a sec, guys. I'll have to take off. I just wanted to, because we were giving lots of great little science fiction story examples, I thought I finished on one I thought was quite interesting. It's from a story. I'll have to find the author, but I looked at it. I read it a long time ago. But basically, the future in this science fiction scenario was because we're in the future, we can do pretty much everything that we want and we don't die. That the only way to live is actually you live one lifetime and then they wipe your memory and then you do it all over again. And that's ultimately where they saw the human race headed to if we got sophisticated enough. So the question is, would you rather be living in that future where you've got an infinite lifetimes and you don't realize it, or is there something terribly disturbing about that?
It sort of runs against the grain for me, because I do have, I suppose, a evolved personal ethic, which is you're born, you grow up, you have an adult life, you have an elderly life, and then you die. And there is a arc there, which is mirrored in every theatre, film, book, and so forth that I've read. And they get disrupted when you get one of these unusual science fiction ideas. I don't know that story, but it's very simple. The construct is very similar to Ishigura's Never Let Me Go, where children are farmed for their organs in late adolescent. And gradually they become aware of this. So it's a very different life. Now they're trying to escape, whereas what you're saying is that there's a choice. I don't know. What do you think, Cam?
Yeah, I'm pondering it myself. I think it probably goes against the grain for me as well, actually.
Well, this could be one of those lifetimes for all you know. We don't even realize that we're in this simulator. Well, thanks again, Mark, for joining us. I think it was a great little chat. I don't think we probably like most of our podcasts, I don't think we completely stayed on the topic of the future of work completely, but that's probably a good sign in a way. We let it evolve naturally.
Yeah. Well, you know what they say, when you see the light at the end of the tunnel, you need to order more tunnel.
Yeah, I like that.
I thought you were going to say, what was the other one? If you see the train coming in one direction, what's that saying? If you turn around and there's another one, I completely stuffed up that line.
I'm not sure.
Well, I guess they crash together. You got to get out of the way.
Yeah. I should end on that note. Then thanks again, Mark. Thanks, Cam.
Thank you, Mark.
Another great chat, and we will.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. All right. Have a great weekend, guys. See ya. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.